The first thing that felt wrong wasn't a sound. It was the way the night went too still, like the trees had agreed to hold their breath. The porch light hummed low. The refrigerator motor eased off, and the whole house fell into that hollow quiet you only notice when you live alone. Then the back gate tapped the post, just a soft, tired knock. One beat, another, and a girl's voice drifted through the fog the way cold seeps under a door scout. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your town or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Hal Whitaker. I'm 58 and I've kept to myself since my wife Elaine passed. The place I bought sits off River Road where the lots stretch long and the woods take over as soon as your fence gives up. I fix small appliances for folks on a cash basis, keep my receipts in a cigar box, and sweep the same back steps every evening out of old habit. Routine keeps a man steady. Up at 6, coffee at the sink, mail left in a neat pile whether I open it or not. I didn't choose the house for its history. Truth is, I didn't know much when I took the keys, only what the realtor said with that careful tone people use when they don't want to say too much. Quiet street, long yard, backs to the tree line. The neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Jensen, told me the family before me had a golden retriever that used to drink from the bird bath and sling water everywhere. She said it with a smile, then looked past me at the woods and changed the subject. I liked it here. The air smelled like wet cedar after sundown. In winter, the fog came shouldering in from the river and pressed against the porch screens. In July, the grass went dry and the cicadas sang until the porch light clicked off. Some nights a raccoon took a run at my trash cans. Sure, but I've seen raccoons since I was a kid. They sound like trouble, but they're mostly bluster. What I started to notice were smaller things. The bird bath turned a 1/4 inch on its base, even though the bowl is heavy stone. A strip of grass flattened at the same place near the fence every few nights, as if something or someone favored that spot. Twice I found the back gate latch down, but not fully set, hanging on by a sliver. I chalked it up to wind and critters. You do that when you live alone. You pick the explanation that lets you finish your coffee and sleep. Inside, I kept one photograph out Elaine in a red scarf, snow on her shoulders, laughing at something I said I don't remember the joke now. Everything else I left boxed. The living room had the echo of a house, still getting used to your voice. Most evenings I let the radio talk low and wandered to the kitchen for another cup I didn't need. That night, the quiet came down the way a curtain falls. I heard the gate and the soft tap again. I eased the kitchen light off with the back of my hand and let my eyes adjust. The yard was a pale wash moonlight on wet grass, the bird bath a gray smudge. The woods stood up dark and patient at the edge of everything. Scout. The voice was close this time, a whisper trying to be brave. I stepped to the screen door and pressed my palm flat against it so it wouldn't creak. Out by the bird bath, something moved a slight shape, arms folded tight like she was holding herself together against the cold. She turned her head toward the house, slow, careful. I couldn't see her face yet, only the set of her shoulders and the shine of bare feet damp with dew. The porch light switch was under my thumb. I didn't flip it. I just opened the screen enough to speak without raising my voice. "Hello?" The figure froze. I heard the tiniest clink like metal against a ring. Then the voice again, smaller than before, aimed at the ground. "This is Scout's house." The gate, still ajar, tapped the post a 3rd time, and the woods past the fence held their breath all over again. I didn't move at first. The girl stood there, arms crossed tight like she was keeping something inside from leaking out, and the way she looked at me, it wasn't startled or scared, not exactly. It was more like disbelief. Like she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Her hair was dark, tangled down past her shoulders. Her jeans were ripped at both knees and soaked through, and her bare feet were sunk 1/2 inch into the grass. The porch light finally clicked on behind me, not because I touched it, but because I'd rigged it years ago to kick in when the humidity crossed a certain point. It cast just enough glow to catch her face. She looked maybe 19, maybe 20, but the way she said the name Scout, the way she held that word in her mouth, you'd think she was 6. I stepped down one stair and kept my voice level. "Miss, are you hurt?" She blinked slow, like she had to remember how eyes worked, and turned to look behind her at the tree line. "This was Scout's house," she said again, like the words might reset something. I told her Scout wasn't here anymore, not for a long time, and I asked again gently this time if she needed help. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted across the yard like she was checking for landmarks that no longer existed. "I was just playing," she said finally. "He ran into the woods. I followed." She paused. "I was 6. I could see her mouth shake as she tried to finish the thought. "Then I don't know where I went." I let her sit on the back steps. She didn't want to come inside, and I didn't push. I brought out one of Elaine's old quilts and wrapped it around her shoulders, then handed her a chipped mug with lukewarm cocoa I found in the back of the pantry. She didn't drink it, just stared straight ahead at the dark yard like it was going to start talking. I asked her name, and she said it quiet, Maya. Her voice caught halfway through the second syllable, like even that name was something she hadn't spoken in a long time. I didn't ask more than that. I called dispatch and reported what I had. A barefoot young woman showed up, confused. Possible missing person. The officer who took the call didn't sound too concerned. Probably thought it was a drug case, maybe a runaway or a breakdown. But when I told them what name she'd given, the line went quiet for a second too long. They said someone would be out right away. Detective Andrea Pike arrived just before sunrise. She was wearing plainclothes jacket, unzipped hair pulled back in that clipped, practical way that lets you know she's worked too many overnight shifts to care about appearances. She didn't say much when she stepped through the door, just nodded once and asked where the girl was. I brought her out to the porch. Maya was still sitting on the steps, quilt clutched around her like armor, her bare toes curled in the chill. Andrea stopped mid-step when she saw her. Something shifted in her face. Not shock exactly, more like recognition. She knelt down, slow, careful not to spook her. "Maya Collins?" she asked. Maya blinked, then nodded. Andrea swallowed. "Do you know where you are?" Maya looked around again, uncertain. "This was Scout's house," she whispered. "I used to feed the birds here." Andrea's eyes went glassy, but she didn't say anything back. Later I learned the name Maya Collins hadn't been spoken at that department in over a decade. Missing since 2009. Disappeared without a trace from Alton Park during a spring picnic. She'd been holding a red balloon when she vanished. Her mother, Renee Collins, had held on to that case like it was stitched to her hands. Pushed for every lead, every flyer, every useless sighting. Buried an empty coffin 5 years after the trail went cold. Moved away. Stopped answering calls. Andrea had worked that case from the start. She'd still kept the file in her bottom drawer. I found that out later, too. At my place, we got Maya to sit on the couch, though she didn't settle. She kept shifting her weight like her body didn't know how to rest. When Andrea asked where she'd been all these years, Maya just said I was walking. That was the word she used, walking, as if that covered it. When asked if she remembered anyone, any faces, any places, she shook her head. Only Scout. She reached into the pocket of the oversized t-shirt I'd lent her and pulled out something small. A metal tag rusted at the edges. You could barely read it, but if you held it to the light just right, you could still make out the name. Scout. They brought her in for observation later that morning. EMTs checked her over on the porch. No obvious injuries. Skin cold to the touch. Malnourished but stable. When they asked for her date of birth, she hesitated. Then said, "I don't know." At the hospital, she was quiet during intake. When asked if she knew what year it was, she guessed. Maybe 2011. The nurse wrote something in her chart but didn't correct her. When they said the year was 2023, she didn't react, just blinked and looked out the window. When Renee Collins was finally reached and told her daughter had been found, she didn't believe it. She told the detective, "I buried my child." Andrea said, "Only I know. But she's alive." The line stayed silent for nearly 30 seconds before Renee whispered, "Please don't give me hope if you can't keep it." Maya stayed in the hospital that night. I didn't sleep much, kept the porch light on like she might come back. In the morning, I found the dog tag on my windowsill just sitting there in the dust. Next to it was a folded piece of paper torn at the edges. I opened it. All it said was, "Thank you for listening." No name, just that. Andrea called me later to say Maya had started drawing in her hospital room. Nothing fancy, just lines, shapes a door, a hallway, a face with no eyes. She didn't explain them. When the nurse asked what the pictures were, Maya said, "I think I lived underground," and when asked what she remembered before that night, she said only this: "There was a lady. She told me Scout wasn't real, that Maya wasn't real either." Then she went quiet again and didn't say another word for the rest of the day. That's when I realized whatever this was, wherever she'd been, it wasn't just a missing person story. Something had been taken from her, and something else might still be watching. The postcard was still inside the wooden box when Detective Pike came back to see me. She didn't say much about it at first, just nodded toward it like it had been waiting for her. I'd kept the box tucked in the same kitchen drawer since moving in, where old owners sometimes leave keys or furniture screws they don't want to bother labeling. The postcard was wedged behind a chipped ceramic trivet, the kind with a rooster on it, like somebody had shoved it in without thinking. The front showed a field of sunflowers under a bright Kansas sky, but it was the back that stopped Andrea in her tracks. Printed in block letters, neat and even, it read, "She's happy. She's safe." You wouldn't recognize her anymore. No name, no return address, just a faint watermark in the corner, 3 circles overlapped like a child's Venn diagram. Andrea stared at that symbol longer than she did the message. Then she folded the card shut and slipped it into an evidence sleeve without a word. That was a few days after Maya was moved from the hospital to a quiet facility on the edge of town. The doctors said she needed time, low stimulation, nothing sharp or sudden. Renee had flown in the same morning and sat by her daughter's bedside without touching her. The reunion didn't go how people imagine it. There were no cries of joy, no big embraces. Maya didn't recognize her. Not her mother's voice, not her scent, not even the lullaby Renee started humming out of muscle memory. She looked up once and asked, "Are you the nurse?" Renee flinched but said yes, just to stay close. The therapists called it dissociation deep-level memory suppression. They said it was common in long-term trauma survivors, especially those taken young. But what wasn't common was the detail Maya clung to the name Ella. She wrote it over and over on notebook paper, carved it into the underside of her hospital tray with a spoon. Sometimes she'd whisper it in her sleep. Renee didn't know anyone by that name. Neither did Andrea. But Maya swore someone had called her that more than once, like it was the only name she was supposed to answer to. Renee tried to tell her stories, little things only a mother would remember. The time Maya got a splinter in both hands from hugging a wooden railing at the zoo. The day she painted the living room walls with washable marker and said the dog did it. Maya listened quietly, even smiled once or twice. But every time Renee ended a sentence with, "You did that," or "That was you," something in Maya's face would harden, like she was being told a lie she couldn't quite disprove but didn't trust. Andrea came by the house again the following week. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much since the night Maya reappeared. Said she'd reopened the case file and started cross-checking old witness statements. A lot of them hadn't aged well, people misremembering timelines warped by time, but one stuck out. A local ranger had reported seeing a girl near the river the day Maya disappeared. Said she had a balloon and was following a golden retriever. Problem was, he'd filed the report after having 2 beers on duty, and no one gave it weight at the time. Andrea found the original statement buried behind a memo about a power outage. She also pulled a report from a now-defunct youth center, the one where Karen Holloway worked back in 2009. Karen had been the intake coordinator at the Eugene Community Center, one of the first people to speak to the media after Maya vanished. Said she'd seen a suspicious man loitering near the park that morning. But Andrea noticed something strange Karen had failed to mention, that she'd worked with a now-shuttered Christian rehab program called House of Grace up in Idaho, a facility later flagged for questionable practices. At the time, it didn't raise flags. But now, with the postcard symbol matching one listed in the old House of Grace outreach newsletter, Andrea had questions. Back at the hospital, Maya had stopped drawing faces. She'd moved on to diagrams. Rooms hallways one with 5 overhead lights and a red button at the end. The staff thought it might be dream residue. But she didn't draw from imagination, she sketched with purpose like copying from memory. One night she looked up at Renee and asked, "Was there a basement in our old house?" Renee shook her head. "Not that I remember." Maya nodded like she already knew that. Then this wasn't ours. That same night she woke screaming. Not loud, not flailing, just sitting, bolt upright, drenched in sweat, whispering the same sentence over and over. She said, "I was just the body," that the name didn't matter. Renee called the nurse, who called Andrea, who called me, though I still don't know why. Maybe just because I'd seen her first. Maybe because I'd listened. I didn't have answers, but I remembered something I hadn't told anyone before. About 2 weeks after moving in, I'd found a bracelet under the floorboard in the back bedroom closet. It was thin, gold-plated, almost too small for a wrist. I'd tossed it in the same drawer with the old keys and loose screws. But when I went to check, it wasn't there. I asked Andrea if she'd seen it during evidence collection. She said no, nothing like that had been logged. But 2 days later, Maya held it up in her hospital room. She'd drawn the same 3-circle symbol on the paper next to it and written the phrase, "For the one who remembers." When Andrea asked where she found it, Maya said, "In the room with no windows." Renee looked confused. "We don't have one of those." Maya didn't respond. She just kept tracing the circles with her finger. By then, the press had gotten wind of the case. A girl missing since 2009 returns with no memory. Photos of her as a child resurfaced online. Headlines speculated amnesia abuse cults. Some folks in town whispered maybe she was lying, maybe she'd never been missing at all, that she'd just run off and come back when she needed help. Andrea ignored all that. She focused on the symbol, the bracelet, and the drawings. Quietly, she started reaching out to former staff from House of Grace. One name came up more than once, a woman who went by Sister Grace. Real name unknown. Last seen in Bend, Oregon, teaching at a private retreat. Andrea made plans to go. Said it wasn't official business yet. Just follow-up. I asked if she believed Maya's story. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I believe she remembers something someone didn't want her to." She paused. "And I think she's not the only one." That was the first time I saw Andrea shaken. Not scared, just tired in a way that comes from seeing too many versions of the same mistake. As she got up to leave, I asked her one more thing. "You think Renee knows more than she's saying?" Andrea didn't look back. She just said, "I think she knows something she's still trying not to remember." Then she walked out into the late afternoon light, and I stood in the kitchen holding the postcard, watching the ink fade just a little more under my thumb. Renee didn't sleep that night. I could tell from the way the porch light stayed on and the way the blinds never fully closed, like she was watching the edges of her own house for something to shift. Maya had been home from the hospital less than a week, and everything about the place felt off, too quiet, too clean, like grief had been scrubbed into the walls so long it just became the color of the paint. There were no photos of Maya in the living room. Renee said she'd boxed them years ago when it became too hard to look. But Maya noticed. Not right away, not with words. She'd stand in the hallway sometimes, just staring at the bare spots above the bookshelf like she could feel something used to be there. The dog wasn't mentioned either. No framed picture of Scout, no old leash tucked by the door. Renee claimed she'd gotten rid of all that early on, didn't want reminders. But Maya kept asking, "Where did Scout go? What happened to my dog?" One night Renee just said softly, "We thought you both were gone." Maya didn't argue. She just nodded like that made sense. But later that night she stood barefoot in her room for almost an hour facing the closet door like it might open on its own. Something about that space had started pulling at her. She told me this later, not right away, but weeks after when the pieces started coming in faster than she could handle. That night, though, she waited until Renee had gone to bed, then sat down on the floor in front of the closet and ran her hand along the baseboards. Said she didn't know what she was looking for, just that her chest got tight the closer she got to the back wall. When she pressed her palm flat to the floor, she felt one of the boards shift slightly, not enough to lift, but enough to click. Underneath was a velvet bag, old and faded like it had been there a long time. Inside was a bracelet gold with lettering so fine she had to hold it up to the lamp to read. For the one who remembers. She didn't tell Renee, not that night. Instead, she sat in the living room and watched the wall clock tick. At exactly 1:12 a.m., she wrote that number on a napkin, circled it, and put it in her pocket. She didn't know why. Just that it meant something. In the morning, she barely spoke. Ate toast in silence, nodded when Renee asked if she'd slept. But her hands shook when she reached for her tea. Later in the bathroom, she closed the door, turned off the lights, and stood in front of the mirror until her reflection stopped looking like hers. I got a call from Andrea the following afternoon. She was heading up to Bend, said she had a name tied to the rehab facility. Margaret Harrow, also known as Sister Grace, listed now as a Bible study instructor at a religious retreat up in the woods. Andrea didn't bring backup. She said she wasn't going as law enforcement, just as someone looking for answers. I asked if she wanted company. She said no. "I think she'll talk to me," she said. I think I remind her of something. While Andrea was on the road, Maya started drawing again. Not faces this time. Layouts, rooms, one with red walls and no windows, another with cement floors and a drain in the center. She said she wasn't imagining them. She'd been there. The drawings didn't have people in them, just numbers 28 circled in red. She told Renee it had been her number. Renee said that didn't make sense, that Maya had never lived anywhere with numbered rooms. Maya just looked down and said, "Not when I was me." Andrea called me from a parking lot off a Forest Service road, said she'd found the woman. Margaret didn't run. She answered the door like she'd been expecting someone. Looked older than in the photos, but not surprised. When Andrea introduced herself and said the name Maya, Margaret didn't flinch. She said calmly, "Do you know where Ella is?" Andrea recorded everything. Margaret spoke like someone reading from a page that had been burned and pieced back together, measured certain off by just enough to feel wrong. She said Maya had been brought to them after being discarded. That they didn't steal, they salvaged. That some children were better off becoming someone new. When Andrea pushed, Margaret smiled. "Names are containers," she said. "We taught them how to survive without the ones that hurt." Back in Eugene, Maya had started hearing things in her sleep. Not voices exactly, more like a cadence command spoken over and over, too faint to understand, but impossible to forget. One morning she told Renee, "She made me say things until I couldn't remember my own name." Renee tried to tell her she was safe now, that it was over. Maya didn't argue, but that night she moved her mattress to the floor, pushed her dresser in front of the closet, and slept with the lights on. Andrea returned the next day with a copy of a 2014 group photo from the House of Grace newsletter. 12 girls, all in matching polos. Hair braided the same way. Blank stares. One in the back row, barely visible, could have been Maya, or Ella, or someone in between. Maya stared at it for a long time, then pointed at the corner. That girl she said used to tell me I wasn't real. When Andrea asked who she was, Maya said, "Me." A few days later, Maya asked Renee a question out of nowhere. "Did you ever try to adopt after I disappeared?" Renee hesitated before answering. Said she thought about it, that she'd even filled out the forms once, but she never went through with it. Maya didn't say anything else, just nodded like that explained something she couldn't yet prove. "I don't think it was about betrayal. I think it was about accounting trying to track where the missing parts of her had gone. That evening, she returned to the park where she'd vanished, the one with the old footbridge and the slope down toward the river. Renee brought her, but Maya asked to walk the last stretch alone. She stood by the edge of the water for a long time, unmoving. When Andrea and I caught up, she was still there. She didn't turn around, just raised her hand and pointed to a patch of dirt near the tree line. "That's where I saw him," she said. "He had a camera." Andrea asked if she remembered his face. Maya crouched down, picked up a stick, and began to draw. The sketch was crude but certain. Square jaw, thin lips, shallow eyes. She looked up and said, "He watched me follow Scout." Then she stood and handed the stick to Andrea like it was part of the evidence. We didn't speak much on the walk back. Renee stayed close to her daughter. Andrea walked a few paces behind, eyes on the trees. I kept thinking about that name, Ella, about the bracelet, the drawing, the number 28. All these fragments scattered like ashes, still carrying heat. And I knew even then that whatever had been done to Maya wasn't finished. It had just gone quiet, like something waiting underground for the right time to speak again. 2 days after the visit to the park, Maya went quiet in a new way. Not withdrawn exactly, just still like her thoughts had moved somewhere out of reach and left her body behind to wait. Renee said she'd started spending longer stretches in her bedroom, lights off, blinds drawn. Not sleeping, not crying, just sitting. The drawings stopped too. Not because anything had gotten better, but because she said she was done guessing. What she remembered now came in pieces, and they weren't dreams. She said that once in passing, more to herself than anyone else, "These aren't dreams." That was the day she opened up the sketchbook again and started tracing a hallway. She said she knew by touch, cold tile, low ceiling door at the end, with a red sticker that peeled at the edges. She didn't call it a memory. She called it a place they kept us. That night, Renee went to bed early and left a light on in the kitchen. Maya stayed up, just pacing. Something about the floorboards seemed to bother her, like they didn't sound right beneath her. Around 2 in the morning, she walked into the living room, knelt on the rug, and slid her hand under the edge of the couch. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She said she just felt like something had been left. What she pulled out was a folded napkin. Not dirty, not old, but clearly not hers. It had writing on it, one sentence barely legible. "You're almost out west." She showed it to Renee the next morning. Renee didn't know where it came from, said she'd never seen it before. Andrea came by later that afternoon. She held the napkin under the light, flipped it over, checked the folds. No logo, no timestamp, just that one line. She asked Maya if it felt familiar. Maya said she thought it might have been from a gas station, but she wasn't sure if she'd been there or if someone had told her the story. Andrea pressed gently. "Did anyone give this to you?" Maya looked down. "Not exactly." She didn't explain further. Andrea started looking into facilities that had operated under religious exemptions, ones that had since shut down, merged, or changed names. She wasn't just looking for House of Grace anymore. She was building a map. Any place that showed signs of having taken in girls like Maya under vague pretenses, rest homes, therapeutic retreats, even something called identity renewal centers. A few had been formally investigated and cleared, but others had gone dark quietly, usually after property transfers or sudden relocations. The thing that tied them together wasn't a name or a license, it was a symbol. 3 interlocking circles, sometimes embossed in letterhead, sometimes carved into stone above an entryway, sometimes just burned faintly into the corner of a pamphlet. Always there somewhere. Maya started sketching them without being prompted. She'd put them at the corners of her papers or inside the eyes of the faces she drew. She said it wasn't something she remembered learning, it was something her hand just did on its own. She said that once during a conversation with Andrea after a long pause. It's like muscle memory, but for something that was never mine. Andrea asked if the circles meant anything to her. Maya said they used to, but she didn't want them to anymore. That same week, a tip came in from a woman in Idaho. She wouldn't give her name, but she claimed she'd once stayed at a place that matched the House of Grace description. She said she'd seen a girl there in 2014, dark hair, quiet, always holding her hands in front of her like she was waiting to be dismissed. Said she never talked, but once asked where Scout went. The woman hadn't known what that meant at the time. Said she remembered it because the girl had said the name like it was a person. Andrea asked if the girl had a number. The woman said yes, 28. She remembered it being written on the wall above her bed. Andrea drove out that weekend. The building was still there, but the roof had partially caved in. The front sign had been taken down, but the basement was intact. Concrete stairs, metal door, hallway with a slope that wasn't noticeable until you walked it and felt yourself dipping slightly forward. 28 small beds, each one with a number. Andrea stood in front of the last one. A rusted frame, no mattress initials scratched into the side rail. A line carved deep into the footboard like it had taken someone days Scout is real. I am Maya. Please remember. She didn't call me from the car this time. She waited until she was back in Eugene. We sat in the kitchen while Renee dozed on the couch. Maya had gone to bed early but left the hallway light on. Andrea showed me the photos from the basement. Not gruesome, just quiet, too clean. Like everything had been erased except the residue of what had happened there. The carving stood out more than anything. She said it didn't feel like a confession. It felt like a message that had been waiting for years for someone to find it. The next day, Maya asked Renee if she could go back to the old house, the one where I'd found her. The property was still in limbo, tied up in a sale. Empty. Quiet. I still had a spare key. We didn't tell anyone. Renee drove her, but Maya walked the last block alone. I watched her from the edge of the yard. She didn't go inside right away, just stood under the back porch and stared at the dirt. Then she got down on her knees and started digging. She didn't say what she was looking for, just kept going. Her hands were raw by the time she hit metal, a tin box rusted sealed tight. Inside was a photo, Scout Young Leash, tangled in the grass, and a drawing signed in childish block letters, Maya C., and a cassette tape. We didn't have a way to play it, but I still had an old deck in the garage. We wiped off the dust and slipped the tape in. The sound was warped, but her voice came through clear. My name is Maya Collins. If someone finds this, tell my mom I didn't run away. Scout chased something and I followed him. Then a lady said I had to forget, but I don't want to forget. I'm Maya. Please remember me. Renee broke down the second the tape stopped. I don't think it was the voice itself. It was the fact that Maya had tried even at 6 to leave something behind. Something more than a footprint or a piece of clothing. Something that told the truth. That night, Maya didn't sleep. Renee found her in the bathtub fully clothed, rocking slightly, repeating the same sentence. She said I was just the body, that the name didn't matter. Renee held her until she stopped shaking. The next morning, Maya whispered a new name, Karen. Andrea looked up sharply when she heard it, because Karen Holloway had been there in 2009. She'd spoken to police, given a public statement, said she'd seen a strange man. But she'd never mentioned knowing anyone from House of Grace. And now Maya, without prompting, was whispering her name like it had been drilled into her spine. Andrea didn't hesitate. She put in for a warrant that afternoon. Something told her they were closer than anyone realized. Not to the end, but to the truth that had been buried beneath all the silence. Something Maya had always known, even if she'd been trained to forget. Karen Holloway didn't look surprised when Andrea showed up at her door. She'd retired early from the youth center, sold her house just outside Springfield, and taken up a quiet part-time job cataloging archives at the county library. Nothing flashy, nothing that left a digital trail. But her name was still on the original report from 2009, the one where she claimed she saw a suspicious man near the park the day Maya disappeared. That part had always stayed just vague enough to sound concerned without offering any real help. What she never disclosed, not to the department, not to reporters, not to Renee, was that she'd once worked with Margaret Harrow. Andrea brought the photos. The newsletter with the circle symbol. The photo of House of Grace girls lined up in matching polos. Karen didn't deny it. She didn't even ask where Andrea had found them. She just said, "That was a long time ago," and folded her hands into her lap like she was bracing for a storm. Andrea asked her what they'd done to the girls. Karen didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the floor and said only, "They weren't supposed to stay that long." Andrea pressed her again. What happened to Maya Karen finally looked up. Margaret said she had potential, said she was shaping faster than the others, said she could hold more. When Andrea asked what that meant, Karen's voice dropped. They made her disappear. Back at Renee's house, Maya had grown more restless. Not frantic, just alert, like something in her body knew the ground was shifting. She'd stopped asking permission to do things. She packed a bag quietly, left a note on the kitchen table, and was gone before Renee came back from the store. The note said, "I remember now. I have to see it. Don't follow me." Renee called Andrea first, then me. She was shaking, holding the note like it might vanish. I asked when she'd last seen Maya. She said 20 minutes ago, maybe 30. That meant she couldn't have gotten far, but her phone was already off. Andrea checked traffic cameras. Nothing. She went back to Maya's last drawings, the ones she'd torn from her sketchbook but hadn't thrown away. One showed a building plain beige, unremarkable. Another showed the symbol. A third had a door low and wide drawn in red pencil with a circle scratched into the floor in front of it. Maya had drawn that same door hundreds of times in the hospital without explanation. Andrea recognized it instantly. It matched the back entrance of the condemned facility in Eugene, the one linked to a sister site of House of Grace. It had once been listed as a regional assessment center for girls in state care. It had been empty for years. Andrea called it in and drove there herself. By the time she arrived, the lock on the back door had already been broken. The main corridor smelled like mildew and heat. Dust floated in thin slants of light through the broken windows. But the place wasn't entirely silent. Somewhere down in the lower level, someone had reconnected emergency power. Faint lights buzzed in the floor trim. Andrea followed the same layout she'd memorized from the blueprint down to the second corridor past the marker with the 3 circles burned faintly into the wall paint. She found the door with the red sticker just as the light flickered. Inside was the red room, still intact, still marked with faint scuff lines from old shoes, still humming low like the air had a pulse of its own. Maya was standing in the center, eyes closed, hands folded. She didn't turn when Andrea entered. She just whispered, "This is where they said it started." When she opened her eyes, she looked older. Not in years, but in the way someone looks when they stop flinching. She said I was supposed to be Ella. They told me Lily had more value, that I was just available. They said Scout was made up, that my name didn't matter. Andrea stepped forward slow. "Do you remember who said that?" Maya nodded. The man. The one from the drawing. He was here. Andrea asked Gregory Fenton. Maya didn't answer. She just pointed to the corner of the room. A man stepped into view. He didn't look shocked to see them. His hair was thinner, his coat worn at the sleeves, but Andrea recognized his face instantly. Gregory Fenton, last known operator of a regional intake program flagged in a trafficking sting but never formally charged. He looked at Maya and smiled. Ella was promised. You were the stand-in. Andrea pulled her badge, but he didn't run. Not yet. He stepped forward like it was a reunion. Maya didn't move. She said clearly, I'm not Ella. I never was. And for the first time, her voice didn't waver. Sirens echoed from the street above. The squad had arrived. Gregory tried to cut through the side hall, but Andrea was faster. She took him down with one arm across the chest, held him there until backup swarmed the hallway. They arrested him on the spot. No resistance, no outburst. Just a faint smirk as they cuffed him like he was still holding a secret. Maya didn't cry, didn't speak. She just stood at the edge of the red room while officers took photos and logged evidence. When they finally let her out, she paused in the doorway, turned back and whispered, I remember now. And then she left. Back at the precinct, Renee arrived within the hour. She found Maya sitting in the quiet hallway near the interview rooms, arms folded, eyes tired but clear. She dropped to her knees in front of her daughter and asked, Why would you go alone? Maya said softly. Because I had to be the one to end it. And that was all. They held Gregory without bond. Karen Holloway was brought in for questioning again. This time, she didn't hold back. She confirmed that Maya was part of a rewrite program taken for a short-term identity reassignment, but kept longer due to response compliance. She used those words exactly. Response compliance. When Andrea asked what the end goal had been, Karen just said, to make her forget. Then added quietly, but she didn't. That night, Andrea went back to the house and sat on the porch beside me. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, We thought we were looking for a missing girl, but what we found was a stolen one. I asked if it was over. She said no, but we finally found her voice. Somewhere, Margaret Harrow was still missing, but Maya wasn't. And for the first time in 14 years, the silence no longer felt final. It felt like the start of something louder, something that might finally hold. The news vans didn't take long to find us. Once word got out that Gregory Fenton had been arrested and Karen Holloway was in custody, the story turned fast from a local mystery to something much larger. Reporters started calling it the Ella Project. That name didn't come from us. It came from the case files Andrea released fragments the press pieced together documents we never meant to make public. A list of names with no photos, locations marked with codes not cities. But what stuck was the name Ella written more times than any other. For days it felt like everyone wanted to ask Maya about that name, as if understanding it could explain everything else. But Maya didn't talk to reporters. She didn't take interviews. She didn't post anything. When Andrea asked what she wanted to do next, she just said, I want people to know what happened, but I don't want to be the symbol for it. The weeks that followed were quieter, at least from the outside. Renee kept Maya close, but not too close. They'd started learning how to move around each other again like furniture you hadn't lived with in years. Some mornings they'd cook together. Some days Maya would sketch on the back patio until the sun shifted. Renee said the laughter didn't come back right away, but the silence changed. It got softer. I'd stop by with groceries or extra tools for Renee's old fence, but mostly I just sat with them. Sometimes Maya would draw while I read the paper out loud. She never commented on the headlines, but I noticed she listened closer when something involved missing persons. Andrea received a commendation from the department that month. She didn't want it. Said she didn't close anything, said all they'd done was tear off a layer someone else had sealed, But she gave the plaque to Maya, brought it over one afternoon in a plain manila envelope. Maya opened it, slowly traced the engraving with one thumb and set it on the mantel beside a picture of Scout. "You're the one who didn't give up," Andrea told her. Maya shook her head. "I almost did," she said. "A lot of times." Andrea just replied, "But you didn't." Karen took a deal. Pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence and her full testimony. She gave names, locations, details we couldn't have found without her. Most of it matched what Maya remembered in pieces, rooms, evaluation methods, symbols etched into uniforms. Karen said there were others. Dozens, maybe more. But she claimed not to know where they ended up. She said most of the records were destroyed before House of Grace shut down. Everything was filed under initials and sequence numbers, she said. You couldn't trace them unless you knew who the girls were before they came in. Margaret Harrow was another story. By the time Andrea got the warrant for the retreat house in Bend, she was already gone. Left behind nothing but an unlocked front door, a half-empty suitcase, and the wind chimes still swaying on the porch. Her passport had been faked years earlier under a different name. We know she got out of the country. We don't know where she landed. Interpol issued a red notice, but there's been no confirmed sightings. The last trace was a cash withdrawal from a small bank in Ontario. That was almost a year ago. Nothing since. Maya didn't ask about Margaret. She didn't need to. She said once during a counseling session that some people never leave your body even if they're gone from your life. The therapist nodded and said nothing. Let her sit with the weight of that. Maya started going to therapy weekly, even though she hated the word. Said it felt like a label more than a space. But she kept showing up. Said the sessions gave her language for what she'd been carrying: dissociation, identity, fragmentation, persistent retrieval. The counselor called it an active recovery. Maya just called it remembering in pieces. She started painting again. Not just sketches this time, full canvases. Mostly forests, doorways, animals she'd once drawn as Scout. She never painted faces. Said she wasn't ready for those. But every canvas had a name, one word on the back in small lettering: still, or return, or voice. She sold a few anonymously online, signed only MC. Then, later, SL. Still Lily. A name she never spoke but left behind like a fingerprint. Renee stopped explaining things to new people. She used to tell the whole story when someone asked why she'd moved, or why Maya didn't use social media, or why she flinched at certain voices. But now she just said, "This is my daughter Maya. She's an artist." And when people asked if they were close, she'd say, "We're learning each other again." Clyde me. I got a letter from Maya that spring. Not typed. Handwritten, slow and careful. She'd drawn a sketch on the envelope of my porch railing with a single mug on the step beside it. Inside, just one sentence. "You were never mine, but I will always be yours." I framed it. Hung it beside a painting she'd left me, a night sky porch light glowing in the corner. She called it Guardian. A few days later, Renee and Maya returned to the old house one final time. The one where Scout used to live. It had changed hands again, but the new owners let them walk the yard. Maya brought the tin box with her, the one that had held the cassette, the drawing, the photo. They buried it beneath a patch of daffodils near the birdbath, tied Scout's tag to a small wooden cross. Andrea stood at a distance watching. She didn't say a word, just nodded once and left them alone. That night, Maya stood outside on the porch. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just the stars above and the quiet of a house that no longer held her secrets. She opened her journal, wrote something down, then looked up and whispered into the dark. "I remember." I don't think she was talking to anyone in particular, maybe just to herself, maybe to the version of her that had once been silenced. The next morning, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a small velvet pouch newer than the first with a silver chain tucked inside. The pendant said one word: truth. Maya didn't react. She just smiled faintly and slipped it into the same drawer as her sketchbook. Later that week, she returned to Alton Park, not to revisit the moment she disappeared, but to replace it. She brought a balloon with her. Not red this time. Blue. She sat on the bench where her mother had last seen her, tied the ribbon to her wrist for a moment, then let it go. It rose slow, steady into the open sky. Maya watched it vanish, then whispered, "Still here." I stood across the street in my truck, just watching. Didn't need to say anything, didn't want to interrupt. Some things you let happen on their own. Back at home, Maya slipped the cassette into a fireproof box, kept it beside her bed, not because she needed to play it again, but because it proved something. That she'd always known who she was, even when someone else tried to erase it. She never asked to be remembered in a headline, just not to be forgotten by herself. That was the first day she didn't ask what was real. The first day she answered it. Quietly, completely, and without pause. Some stories end in courtrooms. Ours didn't. Not really. The hearings for Gregory Fenton were closed to the public, but I sat through each one on a bench near the back. Karen testified on day 3. Her voice barely carried, but what she said didn't need volume. It just needed to be heard by someone who remembered. When she described the layout of the basement in Idaho, Maya didn't flinch. She looked down, once nodded slightly, and then kept her eyes fixed on the floor. She told me later that she didn't need to hear it to know it was true. She'd already lived it. What the trial gave her wasn't clarity. It was confirmation. A courtroom where someone else finally said it out loud. Fenton didn't speak until the final day. No apology, no explanation. Just a request that his sentence take into account his contributions to rehabilitation programs and the complexity of human psychology. The judge didn't dignify it. Gave him 60 years without parole. When the gavel hit, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like a door closing behind someone we never really understood. Maya didn't react. She just stood, walked outside, and didn't look back. That's when I understood she hadn't come for him. She'd come to mark the end of what he still represented. Karen's sentence was less than I expected. 12 years with possibility for supervised release. Some people were angry about that, but Andrea said quietly, she was both complicit and conditioned. Doesn't make her innocent. Doesn't make her beyond repair. I remember Maya's response word for word. Some people don't get out unless someone else shows them how. Then she turned and walked toward the exit as if the courtroom had nothing left to offer. The harder part came after. No more reporters, no more hearings, just the reality of what had happened settling in slow and unfinished. Andrea's office formed a task force, quiet, underfunded, but focused. They started tracing records from House of Grace, combing through insurance filings, real estate transactions, anything that might point to other sites. There were rumors of a second property near Yakima, another in Utah. But every lead took weeks, and most turned up nothing. Margaret Harrow's network had been built for erasure, not longevity. It was meant to vanish the moment someone looked too closely. But something strange happened that spring. A woman showed up at a clinic in Reno barefoot and confused, asking for a man named Father Gray. She had no ID, but a faded mark on her wrist, 3 interlocking circles, same as the ones found etched into the Idaho cellar walls. The attending nurse didn't know what it meant, but flagged it after seeing an old news brief on the Ella Project. The woman didn't know her name. Didn't respond to anything except one phrase the staff tried almost by accident. Buddy is real. She cried when she heard that. Not loud, just a steady quiet flood like something finally unlocked. The staff contacted Andrea. Maya flew down 2 days later accompanied by her therapist. She didn't speak to the woman directly, just sat nearby while Andrea asked questions. The woman never gave a name, only repeated a sentence Maya recognized instantly: "I was the one who stayed behind." Maya didn't explain it, just wrote something on a piece of paper and left it at the woman's bedside. "You are still here." The woman didn't respond, but she folded the paper and kept it with her hand the rest of the night. After that, things changed again, slowly. Other calls came in people who'd seen coverage who recognized names or symbols from their past. Not all of them were survivors. Some were family members. One woman from Oregon said she'd given her daughter up to House of Grace in 2006, thinking it was a legitimate Christian rehabilitation center. She hadn't heard from her daughter since. Another man said his sister disappeared after a court-appointed diversion program in 2010, and the only address listed was in northern Nevada, 1 digit off from a site later traced to Harrow's former holdings. Andrea kept every call logged. She said it felt like trying to rebuild a book from burned pages. As for Maya, she stopped going by Scout in therapy. Said the name was still hers, but it didn't need to carry the weight anymore. She went by Maya Lily Saunders again, formally reestablished her identity through a state petition and DNA documentation. The process took weeks. The hearing took 7 minutes. A judge who didn't blink at the file didn't ask for clarification, just stamped the paperwork and said, "Welcome home, Maya." She nodded, thanked him, and walked out like she'd done it 100 times before. Renee cried, of course, quietly with a hand to her mouth. I waited outside, leaning against the railing. When Maya walked past me, she said, "Took long enough." I said, "You're not wrong." We celebrated that night not with champagne or speeches, but with pie from the diner and a fire in the backyard. Maya sat with her feet-up sketchbook in her lap. She didn't draw anything that night, just kept the pencil moving over the same spot like tracing a path she already knew. At one point, she looked up and said, "I'm not what they made. I'm what came back." I didn't say anything, just nodded and kept the fire going. That was enough. A week later, I stopped by her room to drop off some mail. She was sitting at the desk sorting through old drawings. One caught my eye, a cabin drawn from memory with one window lit and a figure just visible through the glass. It wasn't labeled, but Maya said, "That's where I first remembered who I was." I asked if she wanted to keep it. She said no. Said she didn't need pictures of the moment anymore, just the fact that it happened. The last time we talked about Fenton, it wasn't really about him. Maya asked if I believed people could change. I told her yes, but not always in the way they want. Sometimes you just survive long enough to outgrow the shape someone forced you into. She nodded like she already knew that. Said, "Then I've changed." Before I left that night, she handed me a folded sheet of paper. No words, just a sketch of a girl holding a balloon, blue ribbon, bare feet, dandelions in the grass. I asked if it was her. She said it was. Then added, "But now I think it might be someone else's turn." Next morning, Andrea called with news. Another letter. No return address. Just a postcard with a single line. She was not the last. On the back, the same symbol, 3 circles etched faint and exact. I didn't tell Maya right away. Just watched the sky from my porch and thought about how far a signal could travel if someone needed to be found. The next part wasn't ours to write, but the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. There's a quiet that comes after certain storms. Not relief exactly, not peace, but something that lets you set things down for a while. That's how it felt in the weeks after the last postcard came in. Not because the case was finished, we knew it wasn't, but because Maya didn't have to carry it alone anymore. That mattered. She still met with Andrea once a week, sometimes twice, not always to talk about the past. Sometimes it was just logistics, her new ID paperwork for the state fund that covered therapy and relocation support. But every now and then they'd pause on something smaller, a phrase, a date, a scar that hadn't faded, and they'd sit with it. Not to fix it, just to name it. She kept drawing, but less often. When she did, the sketches weren't like before. No basements, no ribbons, no locked doors. One, I remember clearly, showed a coastline wide open with just a single figure standing at the edge. No face, no name, just space around her. I asked if it was someone specific. Maya said it's everyone who doesn't get to come back. That drawing stayed pinned above her desk for months. Renee kept her promise and started a local support group not just for survivors, but for anyone who'd lost someone without answers. She asked Maya to speak once. Maya declined at first. Then, on the night of the second meeting, she showed up and sat at the back. Didn't say a word, just listened. And afterward, she stood by the door while people left holding their eyes just long enough to let them know she'd heard them. That was more than enough. Margaret Harrow was never found. Interpol put out notices. Some say she crossed into South America. Others think she's dead. Maya doesn't speculate. She said to me once, people like her don't vanish, they go quiet. Different thing. I think she's right. But I also think it doesn't change the work we're left with. Gregory Fenton died in prison 6 months after sentencing. Heart failure. Unremarkable obituary. No one claimed the body. Karen Holloway will be eligible for parole next year. Maya wrote a letter to the board short and without malice. It ended with a single line. What we do next matters more than what we failed to stop. As for me, I stayed involved. Helped Andrea track down old documents, made phone calls when survivors didn't want to explain things twice. Some nights I'd find myself staring at the original photo of Buddy's tag, the one that started it all, and I'd wonder how something so small could pull a whole life back from the dark. But maybe that's the point. It's never the symbol. It's the remembering. The last time I saw Maya, she was standing under the dogwood tree behind Renee's house. The leaves had started to fall. She looked older than she had a year ago, but in a good way, like time had finally started moving again. We didn't say much. Before I left, she said, "People think healing is becoming who you were. But I don't want that. I want to become the one who kept going." I told her she already had. If you've made it this far, thank you. These stories are heavy, and they linger not because they're about cruelty, but because they're about endurance. If something in this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Not for views, but so that no name, no quiet girl, no lost year, no buried truth ever disappears without someone to remember.